Hey everybody, thanks for having me. I'm Christoph Diazio. I'm a general pediatrician, and I am here for the "and now for something completely different" talk. This is a couple standard deviations out of the norm about what we do at a lot of these meetings. So hopefully it won't be a total crash and burn, but I'm looking forward to it. And basically gonna turn the nerd up to 11 here and talk to you guys about how speech and debate really prepared me for pediatrics. Everyone thinks this is the pre-law thing to do, and I'm not sure my clicker is working, so we'll just do that. So, you know, bottom line up front, you live next to Fort Bragg, you learn, you always give the bottom line of the briefing ahead of time, right? So what really is high school speech and debate, how it prepared for pediatric practice and leadership, and how you can support this for your patients, and then how it can help you in your practice, hopefully, because otherwise, you know, no one really can go in the time machine and go back to high school and do it over again, and that's probably for the best, right? So all the images are from AI, right? This is what AI gives you if you say, show people debating while the world around them burns. I don't know why I came up with that prompt. So, you know, a lot of people think that speech and debate is what they see in the presidential elections, right? The presidential debates, that's most people's experience with it broadly. And those are really not debates. Those are recitations of canned talking points. And there is very little clash, there's very little engagement, there's very little respecting each other's ideas, there's very little conclusion, right? There's not an idea that they're trying to, everybody's just trying for that viral moment of, you know, Reagan saying, I knew Jack Kennedy, you're no Jack Kennedy, right? I mean, that's really what they're after in those debates. And so, what we're doing in high school speech and debate or forensics is we're basically putting kids into artificially stressful situations so they have to organize their thoughts quickly, right? And that's a tremendous life skill. There's also individual events, and a lot of these things are very helpful in pediatrics for the things that we do in leadership, right? What are we trying to do in a lot of our exam rooms? We're trying to convince people to change their behavior. They're coming up with things that we may not agree with. Sometimes they may come up with things that seem totally out of left field that are unrelated. And how do we understand, how do we ask clarifying questions that we get to what the real issue is, so hopefully we can move forward and help our patients lead healthier lives and make the best choices. So there are speech events, so just to sort of flesh this out, what we do in high school, so extemporaneous speaking, I'm a little bit of a sort of current events obsessive, and where this comes from is this is an event where you walk into a room, there's 3 current event topics that you pull out of an envelope, and then you have half an hour to write a speech that's 5 to 7 minutes that you have to be able to give from memory with 3 sources and no notes. That's a real skill, right? And so it's a very sort of structured speech, the way they do these things, and you really learn to pay attention. And so what's so interesting about this for the students who do this, most adults operate on a very headline level of the news. When I went for my medical school interview at University of Alabama and they asked me what I thought about Hillary Clinton's attempt to reform healthcare back then, I gave them a 10-level speech on here's the problems with what she's trying to do, and this managed competition is a great idea in Boston, but it's really not going to work in Alabama because of these things structurally with the state, and so you could learn how to do it. My first year as a medical student, third-year medical student, the pediatric hem-onc attending asks the question, can you make a case that blah is going on with this patient? And I said, it's America. Anybody can sue anybody, but I think it would be a weak case for the following 3 reasons. Like, you just learn how to do those, and that's an incredible skill that's really helpful. Learning how to talk with no notes, learning how to speak, know where you're going, and get the words to get there. You watch Chip give the speech, and the way he talks, his brain is operating so fast on a race car brain that he's getting to the right place and can navigate around all the different distractions because of the speed that he's going at. And And that's, I mean, you're great at it, right? But so the extemporaneous speaking thing, you're learning, like, here are my filler words, here are the things that I can say, here's the way I can distract people by walking over to the side when I'm losing my point. You know, all these kind of things that you can do that people are doing. Well, on this hand, and I'm gonna balance this, and you know, you learn how to sort of talk with your hands and the different ways to do things, how to, you know, kind of not do the, you know, the thing most people do when they're on stage when they're rocking, or, you know, the fact that most Americans are more nervous about giving the speech at the funeral than being in the coffin, right? And so how we learn how to deal with public speaking, how we learn how to feel comfortable on stage so that we can explain things to people, right? There are other different events, original oratory, where the student just writes a speech about a topic of whatever. You want to get plugged into the zeitgeist of what the current generation is thinking. This is a heck of an event to judge. It's so interesting to hear what you're basically telling them. You have 5 to 6 minutes to give a speech, write me a speech on anything. It's really interesting to hear what comes out. I mean, it can be staggering. Humorous interpretation. These are sort of like one-act plays where they're doing essentially a funny play that they're presenting to you. And you go see some of these things at the national things. I've been to Second City. I've been to really fancy comedy. These kids are better, right? Like, a lot of these are folks who do go on to Second City, Saturday Night Live, make a career in comedy. It can really be amazing. Dramatic interpretation, this one's a little hard for me. I have you know, the mother who is substance dependent who leaves her baby at the playground. You know, sometimes you're sitting there going, she didn't really just abandon her baby. She's just a high school student, because they are that good. Some of these actors that will present, and it can be just very compelling to see how they do this. And it's sort of a little one-act play that they do in 5 to 7 minutes. Declamation is what a lot of people think of for speech events. This is like where you give, you know, Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, right? And you give someone else's speech. It's an event that only first-year students can do. It's designed to be sort of the intro to speech and debate. So again, AI-generated image. These are fake kids. I mean, that's a little crazy when I said, you know, show a picture of 2 kids doing a speech event. Debate events, the kind of main ones that you'll see, Lincoln Douglas, which is modeled on President Lincoln against Douglas. 2-person debate, affirmative, negative, going back and forth for half an hour. Each side gets to do cross-examination. This is usually more valued debate, you know, like resolved that civil disobedience is an obligation in a society when things are going badly. Or when the government is doing immoral things. That's the kind of debate that they would have. And so it's very values debate, like we're gonna agree on the value of morality. We're gonna talk about what the obligations are. We're gonna talk about societal, and you get into philosophy. And you know, it was kind of fun for me to go to college and, you know, talk to my professor who's had a specialist in Immanuel Kant and realize I really did not understand Kant in high school. But I also really didn't understand calculus in high school. My brain wasn't quite there. But you know, I think the categorical imperative is kind of cool. I still think it's kind of cool. Public forum, this is much more sort of snatched from the headlines debates. You know, things around the idea, and this is much more evidentiary debate. This is 4-person debate. Ted Turner actually invented this because he was called to be a celebrity judge and couldn't understand what was going on in a national debate tournament. So he basically came up with the idea of doing this, that any adult should be able to walk into the room and judge the debate as if it were a Sunday talk show. So there's actually 4 kids debating, an affirmative and a negative, and then they have a grand crossfire with all 4 talking. And let me tell you, judging this during the pandemic on Zoom, not your best day, right? So, because it turns out only one person can talk at a time. And so these are a lot of things like resolve the US government should counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, right? And so Belt and Road is a thing that China is doing where they're going out to expand their sphere of influence, building railroads, building you know, bridges, trains, whatever developing countries need as a way of expanding their influence, and what should the US do about that? Or topics around what should the US be doing to protect South Korea and what is the most appropriate thing to do as response to North Korea. Like, this is the kind of stuff that they get into. And it's really interesting to watch students debate this and have to organize their thoughts quickly and have throw-down fights about tax policy in America and then shake hands afterwards and ask, what are you reading in AP English, right? So seeing that these students can do this, can put those thoughts together. You know, we had students and a young woman in an elimination round, and the guy on the opposing team was just picking at her in cross-ex, to the point where at the end of the round, she was so frustrated, she slammed her note back down and threw her pen across the room. And everyone's like, that's so horrible, right? And I'm like, yeah, it was really unpleasant for her, but she just got to have this incredibly frustrating experience losing her cool about the kind of missile interceptor that America is using in South Korea, right? She's not gonna solve that as a junior in high school, right? But having this incredibly stressful experience where she got to lose her cool over something that doesn't matter, and then later in life, when she's doing the thing that matters, when she's talking to her boss about the raise, she's asking for the time off, she's, you know, having a frustrating conversation with the bank, she has learned how to manage that frustration, right? Have the opportunity to lose your cool when you're a kid and it's low stakes and it doesn't matter. Your decision about what's happening in the Pacific Theater is not going to really change which, you know, planes are where or what aircraft carriers, what theater, and we're not going to go big nuke because you made the decision. It's actually been sort of fun. Two of my kids debated a lot of the things in Eastern Europe, and that if Putin made this move, then these people would go big nuke, and all these kind of arguments. And they're like, well, yeah, it looks like all those things didn't quite happen. So it's really fun to watch their brains work on that. Congressional debate is what a lot of people think of like just watching C-SPAN. This is the hardest event for me to judge because it is very much like actual Congress. There are all kinds of things that happen in that process, and they will straight up debate resolutions. You know, a bill that is proposed that the North Carolina State House should invest a certain amount of should invest 5% of the state retiree funds in Bitcoin. Okay, and what are the arguments for and against investing taxpayer dollars, actual money, into pretend money? And what does that look like? And let's learn about Bitcoin, and let's learn about all the different things. So those are things that I think are really fun to watch young people work on. So you know, that's all great, right? But how does any of this happen in medicine, right? Like, what is the relevance to us in this room who, again, can't get in the time machine and go back? I think we have to acknowledge the fact that we're actually all really pretty good at talking to people. I think Chip did a great job kind of pointing out during the pandemic that we're all really good at explaining complicated things quickly to people, and that by the time you've made it through a residency, every MD has a certain level of presentation skills that a PhD probably does not, right? Because you had to present patients while you were exhausted on rounds. You didn't know what you were doing your first year as an intern probably when you were presenting patients, but just by watching other people do it, just by being a smart person, you had the ability to sort of pick up and learn how people do things. I always joke that because of high school speech and debate, I looked a whole lot smarter on rounds than I really was, right? Like, back in the old days, what they called roundsmanship, roundspersonship is, I don't know if it works, but the idea that you could sound compelling, have a logical thought process, present things well, even though you know, there's no way you know as much as you're attending who's literally been a pediatrician longer than you've been alive, right? But how do you present things? How do you talk to patients? And then as you're talking to the patients, you know, how do you make them feel heard? Organizing your thoughts rapidly is really critical. You know, when the patient comes at you with all the anti-vaccine stuff and just kind of spews it at you, you know, how do you handle that? Which threads do you pick up on? What order do you go in? How do you do it in a way that you're not closing the conversation, but you're keeping them interested in the fact, well, I hear you on this, but that's actually not true because of X, Y, and Z. And I hear that you're worried about this issue, so what's the meta issue? Like, you say that you're worried about impurities in the vaccine and you want to keep your body pure. Well, let's talk about the fact that this virus or bacteria rampaging through your tiny baby's body is the definition of impurity, right? So let's come up with a way to take the thing that you're worried about, engage with it, and bring it around and make the thing that you are most frightened of. Yes, I agree with you, we should be frightened of the impurity in a child's body, but it's actually the disease that's the enemy, not the vaccine, right? So how do we pick up on the threads, listen not just, and PCC does this very well in what I like to call their gentle interrogation. You know, when they do their user stories and they ask you follow-up questions, they're looking for the thing behind the thing that you're asking for, right? Like they're not trying to say, when you say, I want the button here, well, tell me why you want the button here, or what are you really trying to accomplish? And now that I know that you want to do that thing, what if I can grant these two other wishes, pull those things together, and maybe the button won't be right there, but it's actually going to do it better because there's a problem that you're trying to solve that you didn't really articulate originally, right? So those are all really happening. And then, you know, how do we respond calmly under pressure? You know, watching young people go at it with cross-examination. When I judge debate, we still travel with our high school debate team to sort of thank our debate coach. 2 of our children did our high school speech and debate team. And so I tell the coach, look, we'll still go to the travel tournaments if, you know, we'll go with you to Harvard, we'll go with you to DC. We'll do that if we're still net helpful. And it's still really fun. You know, my favorite part of a debate round to judge is actually the cross-examination because it's the part they prepare the least for. And you actually get to watch the questions that they ask and you'll see the flash of brilliance as they pick up on things and you'll see, okay, this kid's trying to lay a trap for them there. I wonder if they've made the connection that they're about to really damage their argument, or they pick up how will they recover, right? And that's really fun to watch, you know, young people's brains sort of coming alive because you don't have to know anything anymore, right? I mean, you know, pre-ChatGPT, you don't. I mean, the Battle of Hastings, when was it, right? You can just look that up on Google, right? But the important thing, the useful thing is how do we persuade each other? How do we interact with each other as humans? You know, that's the thing Google can't do. Certainly you can argue AI can generate a lot of very compelling mis and disinformation. But fundamentally, how do we interact with people? How do we talk to each other? How are we respectful? The other thing that I think is really important about it is that, you know, in my time in leadership, I haven't really been a bomb thrower, you know, as far as really partisan or coming up with the other things. And I think some of that is speech and debate because you have to argue both sides. So my kids, when they went through, they said there were all these things that I really thought I knew the answer, like gun control, right? You know, my kids grew up in the, you know, shooting generation, right? Or, you know, gunshots at school generation before, the kids in Kentucky took their squirrel rifles with them on the bus to school and, you know, would shoot the squirrels on the way home because that's just what you did, right? So think about how all that shifted post-Columbine. And so they said, you know, things that we thought we really knew the answer to, gun control, should there be limitations on prescription drug prices in America? When they debated and they realized there was always something on the other side, right? It's not just as simple as we need to beat the swords into plowshares, that if you live in Alaska where the police response time is measured in weeks, not minutes, okay? And there's bears, you know, maybe you have a little bit more of a need, right? So, you know, if you look at prescription drug prices and you look at what the pharmacy benefit managers do, right? So I had kids understanding pharmacy benefit managers. When they debated, resolved the US government should get rid of means-tested welfare in exchange for universal basic income. And universal basic income is the idea that you just get a check from the government if you're below a certain level of income, that you do with whatever you want to do, you meet your needs. It's actually a fascinating thing to learn about. But because that was set up in opposition to Medicaid, we got to talk about the value of Medicaid and what Medicaid does for children and what the Katie Beckett waiver is. I don't see a lot of nodding, but Katie Beckett was a young woman who was technologically dependent, they came up with the idea that because she was one of the first people technologically dependent on a home ventilator, she was stuck at the hospital. There was no way to have a home ventilator. And so they actually created policy around her, a waiver where she could go home, have services at home, have a home ventilator, have a much better quality of life, much better for the family, much cheaper for the taxpayers, right? So it was a everybody wins kind of argument. Learning how foundational Medicaid is for children. We had our students go on the exchange, pretend that they were purchasing insurance. And you mean we pay all this money every month and then when we go to the doctor we have to pay a deductible? Right? Like, I mean, this is great, right? So, you know, these are going to be future voters, understanding the complexity of the non-system system of payment that we have for healthcare in America, right? What a great way to raise sort of future leaders and for them to have to understand the complexity of what we live with in America with our non-system systems, right? So all those things are, and the thing that's really fun is if I just have you write a report on health insurance in America, you don't understand it the same way as when someone your age is asking you questions about it on stage, right? It just tickles your brain differently, so that's really kind of fun. The other thing that I think is helpful about this is that you learn to have comfort with conflict. How do I disagree with someone without being disagreeable? That we can have an argument, discussion, and I cannot hate your guts afterwards for it. Very helpful with patients, you know, because a lot of us, I think, really do get furious when families don't want vaccines, when we've seen kids in the ICU with these horrific diseases, and because the algorithm served something up to them saying that, you know, the vaccine is dangerous or the vaccine is more dangerous than the disease, and it's hard not to be angry about that, right? And so learning how to manage that, I think, is really a helpful thing. The other thing that's interesting about it is, and where I was going before with the sort of gun control PBM stuff, or the prices of you know, basically drugs, was that, you know, it's such the force for moderation once you have to argue both sides. So just to kind of close that thought out. And then evidence, right? Where's your evidence? How good is your evidence? Okay, I understand that legalizing cannabis is the great thing. That's your argument. But High Times is maybe not the strongest source for that, right? You know, really, Quora is a site? I think I'm gonna impugn that. The World Bank saying that international loans is a great way to do development? Maybe there's a little bias there, right? So understanding, you know, talking about like what's the quality of your evidence. You know, we do that all the time in medicine. People who go into medicine, we tend to prize logic, we tend to prize analysis, we prize data. Almost nobody in the real world lives that way, right? If you look at why people buy the car they buy, they're not usually buying a car for a rational reason. It's an emotional reason, right? And so starting to sort of understand that, you know, okay, you're gonna come to me as a patient with this evidence, I can respond with this evidence, but let me really talk to you about the fact that, you know, you read this concerning thing, or you were given information without context, like, oh my God, there's mercury in the vaccine, as there is mercury in the breast milk. If you really want to get away from that, you're going to need a different planet, right? There's formaldehyde in, you know, this vaccine. Well, there's also formaldehyde in the pears that you're feeding your child, right? So, you know, the dose makes the poison, right? Providing context around information, that context is king. And these are all things that we're learning. And then I think, aside from evidence, the real thing that's important is how do we frame the issue? How do we frame the discussion? How do we talk to people about what are we really looking at? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Those are incredibly powerful things, and we're going to talk specifically about some of the work the Academy's done on that. I'm a Carl Sagan superfan. You know, this is a safe space for nerds, right? But you know, his statement that if you're going to make an extraordinary claim, you're going to need extraordinary evidence, right? That you're going to really have to come up with proof to talk about the things. And if you're going to say that little green men exist, well, you're really going to have to come up with good evidence, right? You can't just make the assertion. I sort of teed up this a little bit before, vaccine hesitancy, right? To know thyself is the beginning of wisdom, right? Socrates. You know, we've got to acknowledge that it is frustrating. It is difficult for us when families are refusing vaccines. It is frustrating when they're believing the latest thing that popped up on social media. Over our 20, 30 years experience in holding the hands of children who were critically ill in the ICU while their mothers were sobbing because the child was dying. That's a lot, okay? That's a lot. And it's you know, I think we have to be empathetic with our parents, that they're being put in a position where they're being exposed, they're being basically subjected to things that the algorithms are serving up because it keeps them online longer, right? A normal person would not go to a young woman who isn't sure she looked good in that outfit and say, you look fat in that, here's how to hide an eating disorder from your parents, right? Like no normal person is gonna hand you the pamphlet on here's how to hide, an eating disorder, right? But the algorithm doesn't care, right? And so, if it keeps people on longer, it will make these decisions. And so a machine that has sort of no conscience, no soul will lead to conclusions that we don't like. We just saw that with some of the stuff with Grok and Twitter and all the kind of drama that's been in the news recently about that. So having no conscience, having no override leads to a lot of bad things. And so I think we have to be empathetic to the noisy information environment parents are. There's a lot of information, a lot of it is garbage. And so how do we respond to that? And I tell parents, look, I'm really sorry you're being put in this situation, that you're being expected to doubt the thing that we have proof about literally more than anything else you're gonna come ask me about, right? Families will come and hang on your every word about what order to introduce solids in, right? And for the non-clinical people in the room, we have almost no data about that, right? They'll hang on your every word about what's the right baby bottle to make the baby burp less. Almost no data on that. And you compare that to vaccines, and my God, to quote Paul Offit, vaccine safety stands on a mountain of data, right? Like this is the thing we have more proof about than anything. And so I'll tell parents, look, if you're gonna doubt me on this, like this is the thing I have the most proof about. Like if you don't believe me about this, you should really believe nothing else I say, because this is the thing I got the most proof about, right? And the safety and the careful process that we work on things with vaccines, it is the highest obligation in medicine, because normally when you come in the hospital, you're there because you're sick, right? And so there's reasonable to take some risks. If you have cancer and we are treating you with certain dangerous drugs, you have a life-threatening disease, that's why we're doing it. But we're giving a vaccine to a perfectly healthy child, so it is the highest obligation of any medical intervention, right? And that's why we are so intense about the safety. That's why we're so careful. That's why we do all the things we do. And so I think it's really important to establish that idea that our motivation is all about protecting the child, right? So, the old saw that nobody cares what you think until they think you care about them. And we do care about them, right? Like it's not a game, right? We really do care about the child, and I think that gets to our moral injury, right? Why we're so frustrated when families say no to vaccines, right? I tell parents all the time, so how do you feel when you're driving down the highway and you see the kid in the back of the pickup truck, hurtling down the highway at 70 miles an hour? How do you feel about that? They're like, oh my God, I would never, and that makes me feel so terrible. I'm like, well, your child walking out of here today without a vaccine gives me that same emotional reaction. Not in the sense that I'm chucking rocks at you, not in the sense that I think you're a bad person, but in the sense that I'm really literally that worried for your child. Because I have seen these diseases, right? I have taken care of kids with pneumococcal disease. My oldest child, I paid $76 cash for his first dose of Prevnar vaccine because it was as soon as it came on the market. And I am old enough that my kids were born when resident health insurance didn't cover vaccine product, right? So, and that's actually a funny advocacy story. So, giant auditorium, welcome to graduate medical education. The dean's up there and they're going over the benefits. And I say, oh, and it doesn't cover vaccines or well woman exams. And I can't help myself. I raise my hand and go, I'm sorry, I just want to repeat this. I'm trying to be a pediatrician, so if my wife and I have children here, the health insurance policy doesn't cover vaccines. Did I hear you right? Yes. And he, the poor guy looked like he wanted to shrink under the table, and he's like, yeah, that is what it says. So I got put on the dean's committee about that, and so my senior year, you're taking care of patients from buzzing around as a senior resident. I get a call to a number I don't recognize, and it wasn't now, so you call it back. Hello, oh, Dr. Diazio, hold for the dean. I'm like, oh my God, what did I do? And he said, oh, I just want you to know I just signed the deal, so we're gonna cover vaccines and well women exams, right? So right, but it's the frame, right? So we get to the framing, right? I didn't say, damn it, I want that. I said, I'm training to be a pediatrician. Implicit vaccines is important, and you're not gonna cover it for my kid when I'm in the ICU taking care of the vaccine preventable diseases. That's a very strong frame to the argument, right? So it's not just, I want this benefit, right? It's connecting the pieces. And so when you lay it out, it is really hard to say no to that. So Paul Offit has a great thing where and my debate coach would always say, don't accept the false premise. So when Dr. Chung stood up here this morning and said, the parent comes in and said, I had no idea that vaccines were these controversial. My response to that is, well, actually, there is no controversy. The vaccines are incredibly safe. There are things being served up online to you that are untrue, but there is no controversy. The vaccines are safe, period, full stop, okay? And where they'll get us is promise me nothing bad will happen because of this vaccine that you give today, right? Like that's their little Perry Mason moment. And you have to say, well, it's all degrees of risk. I can't promise you an asteroid's not gonna come through the ceiling in the next 5 seconds and squash us all like bugs. There is a measurable possibility that that will happen. It's just extraordinarily unlikely, right? Or parents want to space vaccines. And I say, well, we can space the vaccines if you want. It's just not evidence-based and it's literally more dangerous for your child. And they just look at you blankly. And I say, no, it's more dangerous for your child. And they say, well, what do you mean? I say, well, because the car ride's not free. There's a non-zero risk of you dying in the car. So when you're creating these extra trips back and forth to the doctor's office, it's literally more dangerous for you to get the vaccines spread out, multiple visits back and more, which, by the way, I make more money if you do that, right? So my financial incentive is, yes, ma'am, let's come back for a lot. No, but I don't want to do that because it's more pain for your child. And I have all this evidence to prove getting the vaccines together on the standard schedule, the evidence-based schedule, not the delayed protection schedule, right? It's not an alternative because an alternative implies reasonability. It's the delayed protection schedule. Call it what it is, right? If you're choosing to delay protection, that's fine, but I'm gonna call it what it is. And so, not being argumentative, just matter of fact, this is where it is. I had a high school student, or actually a college student, come and follow me around, and we had a family where we did a whole vaccine throwdown. So afterwards I said, what did you think about that? And he said, you're so aggressively non-aggressive. I was like, oh, I kind of like that. Because, I think we don't do as good a job. I'm going all out of order, but, basically I see so many docs, the way we select for people in medical school, it turns out if you're really good at working in those little runes, for organic chemistry, like an alchemist and, playing with these little reactions, that doesn't necessarily select for people that are great at talking to people, right? Like when people say, oh, my doctor's not empathic, she doesn't really seem that interested in what's going on, or he's not that really interested in what's going on. I'm like, have you looked at how we pick doctors, right? I would sit at the medical exec committee meeting at the hospital and look up and down the table and go, oh my God, I'm the most normal person here. And I ain't normal, right? Like, families want to have the autism talk with me. I'm like, it's probably not normal that I memorized most of Monty Python and the Holy Grail. It's probably not normal that I had a colleague in residency who memorized all the beeps and boodles of R2-D2. And you could say a line of Star Wars to him, and he would repeat, bloop, 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 exactly like R2. So like the point is we're not normal as doctors. And so that's one of the reasons why this is challenging. And I think that's one of kind of the speech and debate things that we can bring to it is how do we present things, how do we do it? The other thing on vaccine hesitancy that is proven by evidence is that the strong recommendation is what's really clear, right? That this is what I gave my own kid. My own child got the vaccines out of this fridge, right? I want, when the COVID vaccine came out, I told parents, our doctors who were working that day, who lived out of town, left work, drove home, picked up their kid, came back and got the vaccine the same day, right? So it is not a walking the walk thing. It's that, I keep quoting Paul Offit, but he has a number of great quotes about this where he says his wife was a general pediatrician and her line would be, let me love your child, okay? Let me do as good a job for your child as I do for my own child. Please let me do this, right? And I just think that's so powerful that this is, that's the highest standard. That strips away all the randomized control. Is it 1 in 100,000? Is it 1 in 10,000? How do we control numerator, denominator on risks? How do we do risk communications? Do we do micromorts for it's this many if you jump out of a plane versus have a baby in America, blah, 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 blah. But, this is what I did for my own kid. This is what I recommend for my grandchild, my niece, my nephew. I think this is really good. Sean O'Leary, who's just a hero, he's been all in the AAP social media. He's an infectious disease doctor out in Colorado. He was really wonderful during COVID. I will forever have warm memories of him explaining the immune system as the faculty at Hogwarts, that the memory cells are sort of like the faculty that tell the students what to do when the bad people are attacking. And I thought that was a great metaphor. He had a great thing on the risks of normalizing vaccine hesitancy, that this is the core of don't accept the false premise, right? So when people say vaccines are really controversial. No, they're not. Most people are getting the vaccines. I mean, let's look at, this is your local epidemiologist and, Caitlin Jetelina, who, boy, you want to talk about a hero. It's hard to beat her. And I don't think the little laser pointy thing's working, but I don't know, can you guys see that? But so like this little thing down here, I think that's supposed to represent the 82% measles vaccine rate in Gaines County, Texas, which was the center of the recent measles outbreak. Let's say I'm running for president of America. If I win the popular vote by 82%, I'm the second coming, right? So I mean, like 82% is amazing. Now, of course, we want 95%. We want to shut down transmission. That's really the goal. But it's also important not to accept this false premise that there is this much hesitancy. We are still doing well. It's not to be Pollyanna and say that there's no problem. It's not to be Pollyanna and say that it's all just going to be okay. But I think we have to not put too much behind this idea that it is all going to hell in a handbag. We are having success, and I think as we continue to give those positive messages, this is what I did for my own kid. When people say, I know, well, everybody has questions about vaccine. No, ma'am, I have a couple people have questions every day for kind of the standard vaccine. No, the vast majority of people here are doing it. 70% of our patients have had HPV vaccine by the time they turn 13. Over half of our patients have had 2 doses of flu vaccine by the time they turn 2. No, ma'am, most people are getting it. No, that's not true. And it's not being a jerk about it, right? It's not arms crossed, leaning over. I mean, I'm a 6'3" dude, leaning over 5-foot tall women. That's not very kind, right? So, arms open, no, not a big deal, And then the other thing I think on vaccine hesitancy is also picking your moments. Like I walk into the room and, you see a sea of red in that vaccine history, refuse, right? And, I walk in with a student, and they're like, oh, aren't you going to talk about it right again? I'm like, no, we're going to have the whole visit. We're going to talk about it. I'm going to get down on my knees. I'm going to crawl around with a kid on the floor, right? Bring myself down to his height, play with a kid. We're going to play with trucks. We're going to do all these kind of things. And then at the end, it's almost like I'm headed for the door. Oh, by the way, can you tell me a little bit more about, kind of why you wanted to hold off on the vaccines? Or, oh, you didn't want to do the birth dose to hepatitis B vaccine. Can you tell me how the hospital explained that? I'll say, oh, well, I just pushed the baby out. They just came to me and said, do you want this? And I'm like, yeah, that's kind of a lot, right? I mean, that's kind of a weird kind of time to ask someone if their kid wants vaccine. Do they say why? And no, they didn't say anything about it. I was like, well, for me, the birth dose hepatitis B vaccine is about safety by default, right? So have you ever noticed how the planes don't crash very much? And there's been stories in the news about planes crashing, right? But the horrific thing that happened at Reagan, in DC. And I had flown to DC the week before to talk, 2 days before I was on that exact approach vector coming into Reagan. So yeah, no, I get it. Horrible thing. But when you look at the total number of flights that happen every day in America and against the world, the crash rate is staggeringly low. And the thing that aviation has done such a good job with is that they make it so that you don't have a single failure that brings the plane down. And that's how I explain hepatitis B vaccine to patients. This is why we want to do the birth dose. And they say, well, you know, it's a sexually transmitted thing, and my baby's not going to have that. I say, well, you got to remember we're working on population levels, right? And if you have hepatitis B, there's a great chance you've spread it to your baby, and they then go on and have cancer, and that's horrible, right? And we have documented cases of where the test was done incorrectly, all right? And they ordered one hepatitis B test, and the lab ran the other. Documented cases, and then we had transmission from the mother to the child. We had cases where it was run correctly and the test got written down wrong in the laboratory log, right? Like that happened. That's not a theoretical. My son going to medical school, it took LabCorp 3 times to order the right hepatitis B test to prove his immunity, okay? 3 times, okay? So like they're confusing tests. And so when you kind of lay that out, and then I said, and the other thing, not chucking rocks at anyone in the room, but I have heard that sometimes people have sex while pregnant. And usually people laugh a little bit once they think about it. And, so sometimes moms play in the field, sometimes dads play in the field. So even if you were negative at one point, that doesn't mean you remain negative, right? So there's that as a risk on a population level. Why would we do this on a population level? And then, there's also the reality that we live in a world where we have lots of needle users, right? One of the things that's interesting about coming to Vermont is that they actually have in a lot of the bathrooms places for people to throw sharps away. I think that's great. And I think that's great because we take care of a patient who is pushing paper towels down in the bathroom and got poked with a needle. I have a friend who worked as a lifeguard on a New York City public beach 25 years ago. They caught someone burying needles pointed up in the sand because they thought it would be funny. Our small town of 110,000, they found needles in the playground, okay, where somebody was using needles, presumably when they were there at night for whatever, right? And so when you then say, well, and Hep B is this environmentally stable thing, this is why we want to create safety by default. And then they'll say, oh, sometimes I'll say, well, my wife got the hepatitis B vaccine because I was freaked out. She'd come visit me in the hospital and sit down on a needle. I've had the hepatitis B vaccine. Why did our kids get it? Well, it's those things. It's the kid crawling around. It's all that sort of stuff. So again, we're giving people framing. We're giving them things easily to visualize. We're giving them stories. We're giving them, I took care of this patient who pushed down on the paper towels, found a needle in the trash can. All these stories are ways that we're loading the family with the things that we're doing. The aggressively non-aggressive thing with the student who is following me, I think the reason he said that is because I was just sort of making conversation. Oh, every big fun plans for the summer, and mom tells me about the trip that they have planned on the plane. And so now I get to use that as another reason why you'd like to be fully protected before you get on that plane. That, whooping cough is a terrible thing, and let's talk about what whooping cough looks like in a child. So framing is a big concept. The Academy of Pediatrics, I don't know, has everybody seen the Frameworks thing? The Academy did. Frameworks is a group that the Academy hired that are really social science experts that really went into deep dive interviews with families about vaccine hesitancy. And they have a whole thing about reframing. Most of us in medicine really think a lot about the war kind of metaphor for how we talk about vaccines, that the vaccines are fighting off the invaders, that we're preparing the body for the fight. And the problem with that framing is that it gets people thinking about weapons and weapons not working and consequences and wounded people, and it just takes people's brains into a different place. So a lot of stuff about vaccines for the common good, right? The flu vaccine for your healthy 10-year-old isn't just about you, it's about you not sneezing on grandma, or that sweet lady at church, or the Walmart greeter, right? Because your 10-year-old's vaccine, your 10-year-old's body responds better, understands, learns from the vaccine better than that sweet 70-year-old lady who's working at the, as the greeter at Walmart, right? talking about vaccine access as a public health measure, right? That we are all part of the same community, right? And especially in current political times, you know, the vaccine doesn't care about, the diseases don't care about your papers, right? So if there are members of our population, regardless of their documentation status, who don't have the ability to get vaccines, that's not good for literally everybody, right? Not just the undocumented person and family, but everybody who's on the bus, right? How vaccines are a benefit to their long-term health and well-being, that I want to give your child the opportunity to grow up healthy and strong, and that's what these vaccines are. This is about teaching your child how to grow up healthy and strong. That's what we're trying to do. And then, you know, this is a little bit of a red meat for the, you know, current audience at PCC, but using computer update metaphor, right? Like it's an update. Like everyone's used to the idea of, you know, you have to update the viral protection of your software. Yeah, that's kind of part and part. I mean, what are you doing with the flu vaccine? It's a viral update, right? I mean, that's what we're doing. The virus is shifting, mutating, right? Shifting a little bit every season. That's why we're doing it. And then really my favorite thing is the literacy metaphor, to talk about how we learn to respond to viruses through vaccination. So I already mentioned vaccines as weapons, not so good. It's really better to think about trainers, almost like a coach image, almost like a teacher. And then literacy is so strong because we're learning to read the language of the virus through vaccination. You can extend the metaphor by talking about how we didn't start reading by, you know, with Harry Potter, right? We didn't start reading with the Count of Monte Cristo, right? We started with Cat in the Hat. We started with simple board books. We started with simple words, simple sounds, learning how to decode that the, you know, the K is the K sound and the S is the S sound, and, you know, how the T works, right? That we learned all those things, and then once we learned those skills, we were able to recognize other things. And that's really what we're doing with vaccines. We're providing the body simplified versions of the virus or bacteria that's potentially going to infect this child, and we're teaching the body's immune system, we're teaching it how to read. Once you've learned how to read, you don't have to keep reading Cat in the Hat anymore. I mean, it's a great book, don't get me wrong, but you don't have to keep learning to read anymore. You've learned the immune system, and so that creates the idea of immune memory, why we don't want to forget. And so this then becomes helpful, because as we talk about measles, right, one of the problems with the measles is that it causes immune amnesia, right? That it wipes out the immune memory, right? Like, I mean, that's so cool. I mean, we just figured that out relatively recently, that when we took measles vaccine into lesser developed parts of the world, the rate of death dropped more than the cases of measles. And it turns out it was because the measles disease, when it happened, caused an immune system wipeout, so the kids were then vulnerable to those diseases that we thought they had already survived before. Right? Like, that's really powerful. So it's a great metaphor. It's a great simple thing to talk about. I think that's very powerful. So, you know, this is a little bit of a, you know, kind of funny thing. So I did my own research, right? So, you know, kind of, I think that was actually from Canada, if I remember right. So legislative advocacy, right? It is a challenging time to be a child priority and child advocate. And how do we engage with people? How do we find common ground? There is common ground with everyone. The person that you think is the farthest from you politically, who you think doesn't believe in any priority for kids, there's a great chance they have grandchildren. And there's a great chance that there's a path to connect to them with what they've seen, with what's going on with their children. How do you reframe, you know, the issue to find something that engages them? Well, I hear that you're really worried about people not working and they're lazy and all this and the other. You know, okay, heard, want to have work requirements, whatever. But I'm really worried that the net effect of that is that I can't continue to see patients in my small business where I'm providing care for them and trying to stop them from ending up in the emergency department. Because, you know, unless you're, you know, billionaire level wealthy, where you have access to your private billionaire island hospital on Skull Island, right? And, you know, you can't always get to Skull Island quickly, even if you have a private jet. You know, we are all literally in the same boat, right? And so ER crowding is an issue. It's the same thing. And so framing it is, if they can come to me, I can keep folks out of the emergency department. that's in all of our interest, right? Like we cannot us, them, a society, and everybody lived that during the pandemic, right? And people want to forget the lessons of the pandemic, and so remember how the ER were full, remember how no one could get in, remember how we had patients who died from heart attacks because they couldn't get through the waiting room, right? You know, like all those are things that are really critical. So coming up with a way to reframe the issue. School board meetings, these were always fun. So I was the president of the North Carolina Pediatric chapter through the COVID mess, and you know, would go to our local school board meeting and try to figure out who I could reach on the school board to talk about that I thought we still needed a mask requirement. And my argument at the time, the community they're from, 110,000 people, we're a retirement community. It's Moore County, North Carolina, where Pinehurst is. So we have like lots of very wealthy golf people, and we have lots and lots of poor folks. And we're about half Medicaid is what our practice is. And so we have a whole hospital network that's taking care of those people. And my argument at the school board was that we have to be more careful in a retirement community, because if we let COVID run rampant through the school system, okay, you want to argue that those kids aren't going to get that sick with like wave 1 of COVID, but if their parents can't come to work, and the nurse can't go to work in the ICU, and the pharmacist can't work in the hospital pharmacy, and it's not just the fancy people at the hospital, if you don't have patient transporters, if you don't have housekeepers, right? Like the housekeeper is sometimes more important than the doctor, right? When the study came out showing that the thing that most predicted vanc-resistant enterococci, which is like one of the superbugs you're really worried about in the ICU, was whether the person in the ICU bed before you had it, maybe we've got a cleaning problem, right? Maybe it's not a great idea to hire the lowest paid person you can possibly get in that role. Maybe you want a really excellent person as a housekeeper, right? Someone who is super, super careful and are gonna be, you know, with a Q-tip, you know, digging in the corner of the remote control or the call button, you know, with sanitizer, right? Like, and those are all how do we frame the issues, that the extra $1.50 an hour you pay for a better housekeeper in the hospital might have huge return on preventing transmission of very difficult to kill bugs. At the school board, you know, I don't know if you guys have ever gone to any school board meeting, but you know, you have to like write your name on a list when you get there, and they go through the list, and everybody gets 2 minutes, and they put a clock up with a timer, and that's kind of fun. And so, you know, most adults who go to this come with a pre-written speech, right? Like you watch the people read the speeches. I always would go with no notes and no speech and just see what happens, because people would come up sometimes with things totally out of left field right before you that then I would comment on that, you know, okay, I understand we're here to talk about masks, and you think that the school site was a infill site and a Superfund site, and there's toxins coming up from the tree that is pulling them out of the ground, that is dropping them in the leaves. So, you know, we get to sort of explain the dose makes the poison and kind of throw some other things in while we're talking about masks. But you know, it gives you some real skills on how do we pull these things together. I would encourage everyone to sort of engage with their school board, to show up at those meetings. I was apparently vilified on Facebook, which is one of the reasons I stopped looking at it. You know, that people would come up and, you know, trying to figure out who could we get to that we could have a reasonable policy for where we were, right? And then when school board meetings members come to me now and said, do you think we overdid it on the masks? Do you think we went too long? Do you think we went learning? I said, there are some arguments that maybe we did overdo certain things, that we were too cautious, but that's not the way we make decisions in medicine or judge the quality of our decision. We judge the quality of our decision with, did we make the best decision we could with the information we had at the time, right? And so we have to be forgiving of ourselves. We have to understand where we're at. We have to contextualize where we were with that decision, and we should learn from it, and we should do other things like maybe we want to have a better process for a pandemic, that if people figure out how to run the tests with their own primers, we should give them some blessings to do that rather than having CDC centralize all the things, right? Like, I think you argue, if you look at what happened out in Seattle, where the lab director figured out how to run their own COVID test, we probably could have done some of that stuff a little bit more. So the point is there's lessons to learn. Like, for some reason, a lot of people complain about the F-35s, coming off Burlington. You can hear the roar here. But the fighter jets from here are some of the first ones that responded to the World Trade Center in 9/11. And if you read about the history of 9/11 and the initial response, it's a fascinating history. It's one of the few things that is a really fascinating read that our government has put out, right? And you hear that how, because NORAD, was basically anticipating, the big planes coming over from Russia to invade, right? NORAD was not really on a footing where they thought planes would be turned into guided missiles, right? And so the history of how humans in the situation threw things together, like you can hear the recording of the air traffic controller saying, we think there's a hijacked plane headed for New York, can you get some F-16s in the air or something to help us out? And the response from the military base was, training exercise or real world? And the guy said, real world. And one of the reasons they were asking that question was because that happened to be a day they were having a training exercise, right? So the metaphor and what I'm trying to draw together with 9/11 is not to take us back to, a national trauma, but the idea that we can still learn from traumatic things that they happen, and we can build a better system, and we can do that in an open, transparent way as a great country, right? And that's how we should be learning lessons from COVID, right? So again, framing, how are we recontextualizing? Not damn it, those people are wrong, right? So it's all how we present, tell the story, tell it in a way, everybody got much more interested when I started talking about 9/11, than school board meetings. So now it's finding your audience. So again, AI-generated information, pediatrician testifying in Congress, right? This is what AI comes up with. So that's kind of good. Insurance company negotiations. Hey, it's not personal, it's business, right? I think most of us get pretty angry when we're arguing with people who have rarely any clinical experience about how they're underpaying and depriving children of resources. How do we argue for value? How do we talk about it in a way they understand? Do we frame it around quality? Are they really interested in cost savings? Our local, this is no secret, Blue Cross Blue Shield in North Carolina came to us to say they really want to work on adolescent mental health. And then I found out that they were sponsoring a Chamber of Commerce meeting. They'd reached out to our child psychiatrist. And she said, I'm not sure I should go for this. Maybe you're a better person. So I got myself invited on stage. And, they get up and they say, we went on a 100-county listening tour. Every county told us that they need help with adolescent mental health. And we really need a solution that will scale. And so now I'm going to Blue Cross saying, we have a fully integrated mental health program. We think you should pay more for this so we can take it to scale, right? That's the argument, that it's not mental health is sort of the financial, problem in a practice. They are comically underfunded, right? If you look at the history of mental health codes, they were sort of carved out. There's a big specialist bias in the RUC, which Dr. Chung talked about the other morning. So that hurts them. And then they have codes that are long codes, and a standard no-show rate mental health world is 50%, half, right? So you have low-paying codes, you can't do very many of them per day, and you have a high no-show rate. That's impossible, right? And so that leads to all the problems. That's why we have the limitations on mental health that we have. So framing that argument that the companies need to be willing to invest some money in this, and then also understanding the math that all dollars to primary care in America is 3 to 5% of healthcare spending, depending upon who you read. How many pediatricians are there compared to adult internists, adult GYN, adult family practice? It's budget dust. It's less than dust. It's molecules. So, this is, I think, maybe doctor in insurance hell negotiating with insurance. That might have been I should have written down the prompts because it is really fun. So speech about how does it help you with kind of leadership, making the argument for a new product, the COVID vaccine. COVID vaccine was super scary for our staff. They were totally terrified that the feds were going to come kick down the door and drag us off to prison if we gave even one dose incorrectly, right? And so telling our staff, no, we got to do this. We got a lot of poor folks. They need access to the vaccine. They see us as experts on this. We got to do this, and we got to vaccinate adults too, right? Because we're better at this. We're going to be able to get to the people who need talking to. We're going to be able to get to the grandma who's now taking care of her grandchildren as the mother. How do you make that argument internally in your practice so that when people come up with concerns, you can say, I hear that, but here's the other thing we need to do. For Beyfortus, I had to really talk my partners into this. We went in with, we didn't know if anyone was going to pay for it. We went in with, I think, an initial order of 40 or 50 doses. And because we were one of the first in, it became first in, first swim. And we gave 882 doses the first season. And so when I talked at the NCE about this on a panel with CDC, it was sort of funny that someone from one of the big hospitals in Massachusetts was sort of sputtering, we only had 3 doses to give. And what we saw with that was just state variability in how they put the orders in. So anyway, so the point is that you can make the argument for a new project. How do you come up with ways to make your team sort of understand your vision? And they come to me with things a lot of times where like, I had not considered that. You're right, I'm wrong. We can't go forward with this, or we need to do it in a different way. Advocating for priorities in the pediatric chapter. Pediatric chapters are hugely variable in America, right? We have huge variation. We have some chapters that are really the academic folks are really running it, and if it's not bike helmets, nobody cares. We have other practices where there's a lot more interest in how do we interface with the insurance companies and the Medicaids. State Medical Society, National AAP, when I was president of SOPM, when I was chair of SOPM, the section on practice management, the big frustration was that we couldn't get flu vaccine fast enough, especially VFC flu vaccine. And we found with a goofy little SOPM email survey that there was massive variability in the ordering practices of each state vaccine branch. And I'm not chucking rocks at these folks. There's high turnover. How do you know? Imagine that you work for the state. You're a nurse, you're a pharmacist, you're in that job. And what actually happens, the way the process works is the CDC sends them an email that says you have 50,000 doses of flu vaccine to distribute. Who do you send it to? Do you fill ABC family practices order 100% first? Do you give a certain percentage to each person? Do you just let it build up at the warehouse until you have enough to fill half of most people's orders? Well, that's what some states were doing. And the net result of that in pediatrics is that we had practices that got their private vaccine 8 weeks before they got their VFC vaccine. And so the frame on this became, the way that I framed this for the AAPCO is this is a government mandated healthcare disparity, right? If you're gonna do work, if we're gonna do work looking at are we doing a worse job with poor kids and how we take care of their asthma, that's really important work. I'm glad to do it. But if you're gonna forbid me from giving that same poor kid a flu vaccine because we can't do the bureaucratic distribution right, now I'm gonna lose my mind, right? And so that was the idea that we can't have this, and we did improve that process. So the framing was really effective. I always say one of my greatest experiences ever was watching the CEO at the time, Karen Remley, be on a conference call with CDC and watch the way she advocated. And when they said, well, I don't think we have a problem, she said, I hear that, but we have data saying there's a problem. Why don't you just look at it and reassure us? And when they looked at it centrally, because they knew what was in the warehouse, they saw huge variation by state, and we were able to fix that. So that was Another cool thing that the engagement of AAP, framing arguments, wins. So I'm running out of time here. How you can help your patients with this, it's a unique experience, uncommon opportunity, amazing education. If you hear about it starting at your local high school, cheer them on, encourage them. I'd encourage you to show up and judge at a high school debate tournament. They're always looking for judges. I was literally judged by the bus driver in high school, okay? I am not kidding. I'm not kidding. But again, any adult in the room is who you should be able to convince, and that's a useful skill. So they will show you how to do it. It's great. I do think it restores your faith in the future. You know, you turn on the TV and it's all going to hell, right? Hell in a handbasket. Everybody hates each other. People in Washington can't seem to agree what color the sky is. Like, they can't get together on the most basic things. It's super frustrating. And you know, you will see these young people that are brilliant. It is inspiring that there is really faith and hope, and the American experiment is not over. And then, you know, if you can't do any of that stuff, give them a little money. I think that's it. I will just say at the end, thank you to Miss Marilee Dukes, who is my high school debate coach, and then also our high school debate team, Pinecrest Speech and Debate team, our coaches, Ben Denton, Ann Peterson, Libby Carter, hope you guys enjoyed it. Yeah, thank you. Oh, yeah, I'm gonna go coffee here. Yeah, they're gonna get it for me, I think.
Yeah, okay, thanks. We were just. Okay.
Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. Come on in if you're in the hallway. We're going to get started. Next up, we have Alex Fix and Dr. Lavanya. Alex is the PROS director for the AAP, stands for Pediatric Research in Office Settings. He's going to talk about that. I've had the pleasure of working with Alex and PROS with many of you practices that have participated in studies. I've been involved with grabbing and exporting data and working with many of you. So I'm going to turn it over to Alex, who's going to talk about PROS, and Dr. Lavanya, who's participating PROS practice, has participated in some studies. We'll talk too. Thank you.
Well, thanks, everyone. Can you hear me? Awesome. Well, it's great to have you here this morning. And I think one of the most exciting things we can do is come back and share results with you from the great projects that you've contributed to. And that's what today's talk is about. And some of the themes that we'll address will build on what Dr. Diazio had already mentioned. We'll talk a lot about data. I have some, in the spirit of healthy debate, I have some results that sort of speak to some of the themes that Dr. Diazio mentioned from the Frameworks Institute work around vaccination. And actually, we had some different results if you think about texting families the messages as opposed to individual conversations or public health messaging. So I'll mention that. And we'll really try to have a good time with all of this. And it's really my pleasure to have Dr. Hiro Lavanya with me for this today. All right, so what will we focus on? How PCC and AAP PROS are partnering on current studies, why that participation is valuable, and Hiro will really speak to that, and talk a little bit about opportunities to participate in PROS research. So why is a research guy who works with the AAP but also works at a university here at the PCC meeting? The reason goes back to 1986. PROS's groundbreaking origins really said that we don't do a good job of bringing research to practice and making a difference to the care we provide if we have people in academic medical centers doing research in isolation and pediatricians and nurse practitioners and their staff working in practice separately. So the fundamental principle of PROS is to bring together the wisdom of practitioners in the office with the expertise and resources that researchers have to come up with studies that really do make a difference. So with that in mind, I want to share a little bit about what we found just over the last year in terms of some results. So there are about 98 practices in current PROS studies. We've had almost 500 in the last 15 years or so. There are 5 studies ongoing. You can see we have much of the country represented. And PCC is an important that 30 PCC practices are currently in PROS studies. You can see the distribution, which I think matches the distribution of where PCC clients are, but I'll double check that with Tim. And I just wanted to really thank you first for that participation. So now we have the fun part. We get to talk about some different studies we've been involved in and what we've been learning. So the first one is just a secondary data project. So we're taking data from PCC practices and looking at what's happening. This also involves some community health centers around the country, practices that use Office Practicum and other EHR, and some health systems. In total, we have about 1,000 pediatric practices involved. And so how are people using telehealth? Here are so the objective of the study is to describe the evolving use of telemedicine for problem-based visits in primary care for children across 6 domains on a national scale. This is how people are using telemedicine. Behavioral health concerns, respiratory concerns, endocrine concerns, infectious disease, derm, and digestive health are the top 6 conditions. And that's based on almost 14 million visits between 2019 and 2023. But how telehealth is being used is changing. Back in 2020, During the pandemic, behavioral health was such a leading concern. That was just a huge proportion of telehealth, followed by derm and then endocrine, which was weight checks and other measures of wellness that way. But by 2024, that shifted. We're really monitoring weight and taking account of child well-being in terms of lifestyle and growth is at the top of the list. Behavioral health is second, so still a major force. And then issues like digestive health are way up there too. And interestingly enough, it's not digestive health like let's take care of your constipation. The number one conditions that we see in the digestive health category are things like functional abdominal pain, where people are checking in and treating those hard to reach conditions via telehealth. And as we looked at this, we asked the question, are these telehealth visits just substituting for in-person visits, or are they really adding capacity? And what we found is that telehealth is being used around the country to add capacity for those conditions that are so hard to treat, like obesity, like behavioral health problems, and like functional disorders. Another finding from that study looked at antibiotic management of respiratory tract infections. And so what was known before the pandemic is that there were a bunch of companies that were doing direct-to-consumer telehealth. And when those companies interacted with patients and families, they were giving kids too many antibiotics. They were much more likely to prescribe antibiotics in a non-guideline concordant way. And so what this study asks is, what about when primary care pediatricians in the medical home do the same thing? Is telehealth just a way to give out tons of antibiotics? And it turns out that guideline concordant antibiotic management when pediatricians do telehealth from primary care is exactly the same as it would be in in-person visits. And not only that, perhaps because of the triage process, but behavioral health diagnoses, bacterial diagnoses are much less likely, and antibiotic prescription is also less likely in those telehealth visits. And you may wonder, but then if people are using telehealth, are people coming back much more often or having complications? There was no difference in the need to change antibiotics after telehealth visits compared to in-person visits, and there was no increase in the need for follow-up visits or other kind of health interventions in those kids. So telehealth really proves to be a safe way to manage antibiotics for respiratory tract infections. So this next one is one that touches on some of the messaging that Dr. Diazio was talking about. And just because I think it's important to acknowledge the times we're living in, these are results from a study that was canceled by NIH because it addressed vaccine hesitancy. And so fortunately, we were able to complete the first year of the study. We're analyzing the main results. But what I wanted to share is the results we had from talking to families about what messages most resonated with them when we texted them through text messages and how they wanted us to approach that. I think some of the lessons the questions were specific to vaccination, but I think some of the lessons speak to broader messaging strategies that might be applicable to texting. So we developed these messages based on behavioral science principles. We involved 4 practices. 18 parents were involved. We included English and Spanish speakers. Parents graded messages based on how motivating they felt the messages were. And they were iteratively refined, with the ones with lower grades discarded. And an abstract about this project was presented at the Pediatric Academic Society's meeting this year. So this is what we found. What were the elements to include? The practice's name and phone number so people know it's not spam. A link to schedule an appointment so people can take the minimum number of steps possible to be engaged and connect and get that vaccine. Include the child's name unless there's more than one name, and then you can just say your children. And that's a way of personalizing it and, again, making a specific connection and also not confusing people who might have multiple kids. What about the themes in those messages that matters? Give planning prompts like, you're due in a week. Come, schedule the visit. Talk about not missing out. That message actually resonated. This idea that if you don't schedule now, maybe the supply will run out or you could get sick. You don't want to miss out on this chance at prevention. So the issue of how bodies help how vaccines help a body get ready to challenge a virus. Again, not the military metaphor, but this idea of challenging the virus. And also, there is a bit of a community social good element that families really responded to. Being healthier when everyone is vaccinated. So what are some of the themes that didn't resonate? Interestingly enough, because frameworks found that the software metaphor was helpful in terms of updating, families did not like that message as an individual text message strategy. They didn't want to hear about low vaccine supply. They felt like missing out was much better. And even though the idea of being healthier when everyone is vaccinated was really positively received, the idea of just going out and saying we want to protect the community, that was a little too diffuse and a little too about everyone. So some things that might be applicable and that you can think about using. Another set of big results that came out this year and benefited from recruitment and PROS practices, including practices that use PCC, are from the NIH RECOVER initiative, which stands for Researching COVID to Enhance Recovery. And the big question that that study asks is, what is long COVID in children? There was lots of talk about long COVID in adults and different aspects of it, but really no one had any idea what it looks like in children. And this study provided that answer. So in a series of 2 publications that I'll summarize on the next 2 slides, a picture of what long COVID is all about came out. And I encourage you to think about it, and I've started doing it in my own primary care practice, is when you have kids who have nonspecific mixes of symptoms, long COVID actually has a lot of explanatory power with so many kids exposed as a potential source of those problems. So here we go. What did they find? All right. For infants and toddlers, what did long COVID look like compared to kids who didn't have it? More likely to have trouble sleeping, fussiness, poor appetite, congestion, dry cough, and a wet cough. Preschool age kids were a little bit different, still the dry cough. Daytime tiredness and sleepiness or low energy was especially common. Now we're going to move on to the higher age groups, and I apologize for the small font, but I'll tell you the highlights. School age kids uniquely, fears, school refusal, palpitations, and itchy skin and rashes were much more common. In adolescents alone, panic attacks. Similar to one of the things we heard a lot in adults, loss or differences in smell, and congestion, chronic congestion. And common to both the 6 to 11-year-olds and the 12 to 17-year-olds were a number of additional symptoms. Trouble sleeping, tired after walking, low appetite, anxiety and depression, fear of crowds or agoraphobia, dizziness, and stomach aches and muscle aches. So as you start to see these complaints, which admittedly are exceedingly common and show up in different ways, it just is another element to add to the differential to think about long COVID in that context and how it may or may not be contributing. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about the STOP HPV trial that I've mentioned when I presented in the past, and we have some new results related to that. So that study was really about how can we as pediatricians best prevent cancer. We know from results of that study that when pediatricians were trained in a 1-hour set of 3 modules, that they were like about 20 minutes each, maybe even less, that they were better able to communicate and responded very positively and enjoyed the training. And not only that, but missed opportunities for vaccination when kids came to the office and were due dropped dramatically for initiation when the pediatrician referral is especially important. And now we're working with Title V programs from different states to disseminate this. So we've partnered with Michigan and Alabama, and they're distributing the modules to a range of health professionals. Trainings that were developed in PROS with this group and originally developed for pediatric clinicians are now being shared much more broadly. So this next slide shows the range of different stakeholders with whom they've been shared. Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, the Child and Adolescent Health Centers, the state immunization programs, local maternal and child health programs, the American Cancer Society, public health nurses, vaccine champions. And in Alabama was really interesting. They added a partnership with dentists. It turns out a lot of dentists don't regularly talk about HPV in the context of HPV disease, but the fastest growing cancer that's HPV related is oral cancer, and that suffering is particularly relevant to dental care. And so we engage the dentists. So the Alabama Board of Dental Examiners disseminated it to its members, the Alabama Department of Public Health and Cancer Control, the Alabama Breast and Cervical Cancer Early Detection Program, county health departments, the Board of Nursing, Comprehensive Cancer Center at UAB, University of Alabama at Birmingham, the American Cancer Society, a Maternal and Child Health Leadership Group, and the AAP chapters. So it just sort of speaks to the fact that this information originally generated with practices is now having much more reach. And we're submitting a grant now that will build on the Stop HPV model to do the same thing for influenza vaccine, which is suffering from dramatically dropping rates in the context of rising vaccine hesitancy and misinformation. So we're adapting that information for influenza, and we'll test 4 best practice office system changes. That grant is being submitted this year, so we may be recruiting for it when I'm here, hopefully next year. And in an ongoing way, we have the comparative effectiveness through collaborative electronic reporting consortium. So this is a way that practices can participate in research without clinicians having to do much of anything except complete a data use agreement. So I encourage all of you who haven't had a chance to participate in PROS to think about doing this and applying. But the results can be really helpful. This is one study that was led by Stan Grabczewski, an investigator out of CHOP, that asked, how do allergic conditions unfold in childhood? Lots of anecdotes, but this looks at records of millions of kids to see how it happens. Atopic derm is usually the first symptom, peaking at 4 months, and about 10% of kids affected. IgA-mediated food allergy, 13 months. Asthma, 13 months, it starts to show up and peak. Allergic rhinitis for kids 2. And then eosinophilic esophagitis, much less common, but still present and peaking around 3 years of age. So we know this because of the data supplied by PCC and others that allows us to look at these patterns. So now it's my pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Lavanya, who'll talk a little bit about her extensive experience working with PROS. And then I'll wrap up by talking a little bit more about future directions. Thanks, everyone.
All right, can everyone hear me? All right, so I'm Hero Lavanya. I'm a pediatrician in Georgia, 2-provider practice, and I joined AAP Pro several years ago, and the reason I did was because in medical school, I did a research study where I was looking at token economy and seeing how if I could use token economy to decrease sugar intake in children. And as a scared little medical student who'd never been on the debate team, I had to go in front of the IRB twice. And if you've never done that, I highly recommend a beta blocker. But yeah, it's scary. They're very intimidating, not pediatric friendly at all. So I decided that joining AAP Pros was great because I didn't have to go in front of the IRB and I didn't have to write grants. So I've been working on many projects with them, and this year I ended up being a part of PROS as a Georgia representative. And it's amazing what they do. So before someone has a study, they talk to a smaller group of us, and we see if it's going to be viable in a small pediatric office or even a large pediatric office. And then they go back, they adjust the studies, and then they come to the full board. We talk about it some more and vote. And once we vote, we decide if it's going to work or not. And if it does, then the study goes for grant funding. Once the study is approved, the pros team starts recruiting practices, and that's where many of you come in. So you're not left to figure things out. Like, they hold your hand the entire way. None of the studies that I've worked on have I ever felt like, oh, this is too much for me. So, and the amount of time commitment you want to do really depends on you. So there are some studies where, like the telemedicine study, I think I just signed some paperwork and let the data flow through PCC, and that was it. So it was HIPAA safe, stress-free, and I didn't really have to do much. The Stop HPV study, that was amazing. So we collected baseline vaccination rates for HPV, and then the providers and nursing staff, we had to complete these like short modules over a course of a few months. And so we looked at our rates, and before the study, we had about 30 to 40% HPV vaccination rates in our practice. And then after the study, we jumped up to about 60 to 70%. So we could see that real change in our dashboard every month. It was just amazing. Right now, I'm participating in the Heart Plus study, so we're in the early phase of collecting data. And the study has two major goals. So first, we're trying to identify teens at risk of depression or suicide and help them develop their own personalized digital safety plan. We're going to provide access to what's called a Bright app, and then this app is going to be like a teen focus designed to help them build coping skills for those intense moments when emotions are high and they need something to ground them. Data collection takes me about 5 minutes a day, but the potential to save lives is powerful. As far as study requirements varies, but you can get offered perks like Mach 2 or 4 credit, and sometimes you get monetary compensation. So my daughter did the long COVID study, and she's still getting paid for some of it, so she's excited about that. So sometimes the parents don't get paid, sometimes the children get paid, sometimes it's vice versa. So it really makes it worthwhile for the patients as well. But my main takeaway is that PROS makes it possible for pediatricians like us to participate in meaningful research without flipping our schedules upside down. You can make a difference one study at a time or even one click at a time. And if a 2-provider practice can do it, all of you can do it. So if you're even a little bit curious about PROS, come talk to one of us. We'd love to have you be a part of this work. Thank you.
Thanks so much to Dr. Lavanya for giving that sort of firsthand experience. And I'll tell you a little bit more about how you can share your information with us, and then we'll also be at a table over lunch. Oops. Let's see. Let me click on reload. Should I just double click it and open it back up? Oh, okay. Then you know what? I'm just going to go with it.
Go ahead.
Fair enough.
I'll work it out.
Here we go. All right, but can I advance the slides? Not so much. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about the studies that are upcoming, because I kind of know about them. All right, so the first one that I wanted to, oh, here we go. Multiple studies are in the pipeline. There you have it. Thank you to our expert tech team. This one is really cool. So this point of advocacy, we have a number of studies that have fundable scores where we're waiting for their approval. This is one of them. I hope that it will start as early as this fall. So one of the big things that we all struggle with as pediatricians, I think, is when families come to us and start to mention that their kids aren't sleeping well. And we have a sort of set of guidance that we can sometimes bring. And we also struggle a lot with families and kids, teens in particular, who are using social media all the time in a way that's disruptive to their sleep and other aspects of their life, including their academic success. This study is really a marriage of those two. What we aim to do with this study, that will be enrolling a number of pediatricians and pediatric offices, is to adapt. The AAP created a tool to use social media in general, to guide parents in using social media. We want to make it so that it can be used in a targeted way by pediatricians working with families to address sleep. So this study was submitted to the National Institute of Mental Health. It has a fundable score. It's working its way through the process, and we're hoping to bring it to you soon, really to address this sort of profoundly difficult and common issue of how do we get kids to get off media and sleep better. Our next study. This is by a study that's being led by two national leaders in the field of firearm research and health communication. Patrick Carter, who's at the University of Michigan in their Firearms Center, and Ken Resnikow, who's really probably the international leader in motivational interviewing. So this study will ask the question, can we better motivate families to safely secure their firearms at home in the current environment? Now, what the literature suggests is that even in states where people are very attached to their firearms, and for individuals who are, nobody wants to see kids shot by guns that are unsecured. And so what this is a strategy to do is to help us in pediatric offices better get gun locks into families' hands and have them use it. Again, it's received a potentially fundable score by NIH. We're waiting to see what happens. Another study that's in development, actually, that's going to be co-led by Sean O'Leary, who no plant, but Christoph mentioned this morning, and Doug Opal, who's another investigator. And that's going to look at communication strategies around early childhood vaccination that are increasingly important as we see rates dropping. So that will be submitted soon and will be, if it's funded, a study that will involve quite a large number of pediatricians. And then finally, there's a program called Greenlight that some of you may have encountered. They've been working on developing it for, I'd say, more than a decade. And they had a publication that came out this year that showed using a set of strategies that primarily involve texting families at home with obesity-related information. They were able to impressively prevent obesity among kids at age 2 years compared to those who didn't participate. There have been many, many studies have tried and very, very few that have succeeded. And the ones that have succeeded haven't been grounded in an intervention like this that's as scalable. They've been more labor intensive. And so that's a grant that we're developing and we look forward to submitting in the next year. And that also will be open to involving many practices. And so I think something that we can all aspire to prevent obesity better, and also to test how and in what contexts it really works in primary care offices, just because one study is one study and it's amazing, but we need this to work for all children. So I'll flip to the last slide. We're open for questions. And before we're done, this is a safe QR code. If you could please scan this QR code. The magic of PROS is that we take ideas that come from people like you and find investigators and projects that are a fit and fundable strategies so that we can actually test them. And so this asks for your name, your email, and any ideas you might have for studies. And it also lets us know who you are so that we can reach out as opportunities come up and tell you about different projects. So we want to thank all of our funders, the AAP, NIH, our investigator partners, the HRSA, the Health Research Service Administration Maternal and Child Health Bureau, PCORI, the Agency for Research, Healthcare Research and Quality, and most importantly, for you and your practices and the families within. And so I don't know what our schedule is in terms of opportunity for questions, but about 10 minutes for the next session starts. Oh, good. All right. So if anybody has questions, we're open to them, and we'll also be here afterwards and can talk to you one-on-one, and then I'll be at a table downstairs over lunch and look forward to seeing you there. So raise your hands, let's jump in, and feel free to direct questions at Dr. Lavagna, who knows much more about the experience of doing them, or to me. Here, please.
My question is, so your practice of 2, for larger practices, maybe to book
Right.
you, do you have to have, I don't want to say buy-in, because everybody agrees this is good, but do you have to have participation of all of the practice members in order to participate?
All right, so the question was, does everybody in your practice need to participate in order to join a study? So the answer is no. We want pediatricians who are interested in participating to join, even if there's someone in the practice who isn't right for a particular study. And the EHR stuff doesn't involve anyone having to do much, and so it's very easy for the practice to participate as a whole. Other questions? Hi. So the question is, do you get to choose, or is it more of an assignment? Do you want to talk about?
You get to choose which study you want to be in. So sometimes they'll email you and say, hey, do you want to be in this study? And you can decline it, but they will give you a little information about what the study is and how much work it'll entail and all that. So, but if you don't have time, you can just say, not this time around.
Yeah, so being part of PROS gives you the opportunity to participate, not the obligation to participate. Anyone else? Well, thanks. Oh, back there. Yep.
Okay, let's talk. Are you?
All right, awesome. Anyone else? So if you haven't yet, please scan the QR code. Please visit us over lunch. We have swag. And thanks so much for taking a part of your day to share with us, and for those of you who've participated.